As programmers, we're always using object properties. It's kind of the bread and butter of object-oriented programming. C# gives us some really interesting and sophisticated ways to work with properties, some of which you may not know about. So in this video, I'm going to do a quick tour through how we can handle properties in C# and hopefully show you a few new tips and tricks. So for starters, I've got a class here called package, and let's give it a property to track its weight. So the simplest way to do this, you've probably seen this, is to write something like this. So this is what's called an auto-implemented property, and I'll explain that more in a minute. But let's go ahead and test it out and use it. So let's make a package. Let's set its weight, and let's use the property. So console.writeLine, we'll do a little string interpolation. And let's see if that works. Yep, the package weight is 25. Perfect. So this is an auto-implemented property. Let's do an explicitly implemented one, a not auto one. This would be a classic property with a private backing field. And then when we implement our property, we're going to give it a getter and a setter that use this private field. So for here, we would simply return weight as the getter, and we can say weight equals value as the setter. So this is kind of classic object-oriented technique. The idea being that objects, classes, should keep their internal state, their data private, and then they should expose it on their terms, maybe a getter or a setter, however they want. So this is not an auto-implemented property. In fact, this is what the auto-implemented property implements for you behind the scenes. So the question is, why would you want to do this? One reason is to put some validation in the setter. So for example, we might say if value is less than or equal to 0, let's throw an exception. Another thing that you can do here is if you've got an observer pattern going on where something else wants to know if the weight changed, you can fire off that event or notify the observer. And that would be written like this. So if weight does not equal value, that is, if we have an actual change going on, then update our private field and then fire off the observer event. I'm not going to actually implement that code right here, but that would be where you notify someone of the change. This should not have made any difference. Our code should still compile and run, and it does. So this is a very nice, robust way to implement a property with a getter and a setter and some logic. Now, recent C# gives us arrow functions to clean some of this up. So for example, on the getter, we can actually replace that with that. And so this gives us a one-line shorthand for the getter using an arrow function. You can do the same thing with the setter, but then you don't have the ability to write this complex expression. So if we did that, it would look like this. Sorry. So there's the arrow function setter. At this point, we're pretty much almost back to an auto property. Let's compile it and run it and see if it works. The package weight is 0. Why is it 0 all of a sudden? Oops. There's a bug because I wrote the setter wrong. There we go. Okay, so those are your basic properties. Now, One really common pattern is to have a read-only property that you have to initialize when the class is created. That's very, very common. And so let's make it a read-only property. And in fact, we can make this even simpler. A read-only property can be written like that without even the get keyword. So how do we now initialize weight? Well, the classic way to do this is with a constructor. So now our class has a constructor that requires you to specify a weight. So we'll change our test code. And now we have a read-only property that is initialized. Last thing I want to show you is there really actually is a way to combine the auto property style of doing things with a init-only property and get away from having to write constructors. So I'm just going to blow this all away. We'll go right back to our initial implementation here. And we'll give it a getter, but instead of giving it a setter, we're going to use the init keyword. So what that means is you can only set it when you initialize a new one. So our code over here now has to change, and we have to use this object initializer syntax where we say weight equals 25, and we specify the property. So we're creating a new package, and we're setting its property in the initializer. So let's make sure that works. And it works. And one thing I'll point out is I cannot do this, package.weight equals 10. So that should not compile. If I attempt to build that, it says the init-only property can only be assigned on the object initializer. So that, again, is how this init-only property works. And in C# 11, which I haven't installed here, there's actually a new keyword called required, where I can say public required int weight, and then it forces the user to specify it in the initializer. So there you go. Some tips and tricks for how to get the most out of your properties in C#.